Illness and Cure by Joost Meerloo. Studies on the Philosophy of Medicine and Mental Health. Part 1. The Concept of Disease. A historical investigation of the concept of disease and healing is needed because not only does it point out man's eternal struggle with suffering, but it also shows us the repetition of errors. The chapter on Unwitching the Witches is added because it makes us honestly ask how much we are using our own witchcraft to mask final clarification. Hippocrates and the Art of Methodical Clinical Thinking. The history of any science is largely a history of trial and error, a multitude of mistakes paving the way for more refined hypotheses and clearer glimpses of an elusive truth. The history of a science also presents us with descriptions of man's various approaches to difficult problems, and makes it clear that methodology always leaves its imprint on the findings. The purpose of this chapter is to demonstrate some of the ways in which changes in method and methodological approach through the years have transformed the outlook of the medical student of man. Hippocrates the Great, 460 to 377 BC, as Aristotle called him, came from a family of physicians attached to the temple of Aesculapius at Kos. His concept of disease marked a historic point in man's scientific and cultural evolution, for he set forth a doctrine of mental discipline and clinical theory that served as a source of reference for practitioners for centuries thereafter. His way of thinking provides a guide for our multiple and eclectic approach to medical problems even today. Hippocrates separated medicine from magic, theology, and philosophy. He condemned witchcraft, incantation, and sacrifices as methods of cure, and initiated instead a systematic clinical study of sick persons, teaching that disease is a natural process. Natural powers are the healers of disease. The physician has to assist nature. The breadth of Hippocrates' knowledge and the extent of his contributions make him the father of scientific medicine, but his wisdom cannot be fully appreciated without a glance at the more primitive beliefs that dominated the art of healing before him. Primitive medicine. Disease and the threat of death are reacted against instinctively even by animals, and from the fields of archaeology and anthropology we have evidence that man was therapeutically active even in his earliest period of development. Primitive man must have attained a fairly high degree of intellectual growth, however, before reaching the stage of collecting and collating his experiences and making conscious use of his knowledge. Once that had been done, remedies and practical methods of treatment came to be handed down from generation to generation. Since the ability to heal implies the ability to help others or to dominate them with mysterious magic powers, medical practice became an avenue either for expressing sympathy, charity, and cooperation, or for coercion by the sorcerer and the medicine man. Incantation vied with magic potions, ghosts, medical charms, and sacrifices. Popular medicine is of necessity empirical. Everyday experience always precedes theoretical understanding. And medical folklore and myth have always existed alongside the theoretical and careful clinical approach which attempts to deduce practical rules from experience. Man cannot easily drop his need for magic explanation. Popular medicine to this day betrays traces of this primitive and magical need, but any premature attempt to evolve a scientific system from practical everyday trial and error medicine may lead to oversimplification. An example is the age-long search for a general prototype of all remedies, one that may be prescribed indiscriminately for every disease. In the Middle Ages, many alchemists searched for an arcanum, the mystical, omnipotent remedy. In our epoch, the public often regards antibiotics as just such an arcanum. Popular medicine was and still is concerned chiefly with treatment by means of magical potions, with expectations of magical results, mystical cure, not with the most logical methods of treatment. Hippocrates, recognizing that producing awe and astonishment in the crowd was the aim of many a spectacular treatment, criticized this deceiving magic, yet it is still widely practiced today. The wondering and curious spirit of primitive man was activated by the fear and oppression imposed by an uncontrollable and hostile universe. It is quite reasonable to suppose that an awareness of suffering, disease, and death has done more to accelerate man's thinking processes than any other factor in life. Primitive man felt, just as we do, the need to find explanations for his fears in order to argue them away. Direct and obvious reality was often less real to him than the imaginary. Chapter 2. Hermann Boerhaave as the symbol of clinical eclecticism. That I dedicate this chapter to Hermann Boerhaave is because I received my medical training in Leiden, Holland, where the medical school is still permeated with the spirit of that great 17th century teacher. In the 2,000 years between Hippocrates and Boerhaave, the science of medicine developed in various directions. Clinical experience widened and therapeutic technique improved. But the great change was from a primarily deductive and philosophical approach to the inductive and empirical. Experience and observation increasingly took the place of theory over the centuries. During the Middle Ages, medical research was necessarily limited by the theological constructs of the day and was largely carried out by the alchemists with their studies of the curative properties of various elements. The biological ideas of Aristotle were extended and scientifically ordered, while the anatomical system of Galen was accepted in its totality, but all theories remained within the confines of Thomistic philosophy. The Middle Ages were a period of immense intellectual activity, but it was also a period not able to break its bonds and explore beyond the horizons of its world. Man's curiosity was limited by theology. A change came, however, with the advent of Paracelsus, a Swiss alchemist and physician born in 1493. The eye of man, which had, in the main, been turned inward, now turned outward to examine nature. Paracelsus taught that the whole natural world was fit to be studied by man, that everything in it could be measured, classified, and fitted into general patterns. Paracelsus himself was a wanderer between the medieval and a modern world. He fought against the scholastic trend of his day, made use of popular medicine and folklore. He believed that man is a microcosm, mystically connected to the macrocosm. According to him, the cosmic influences expressed by philosophical and astrological laws are mirrored in the human body, and the vital energy, the archeus, controls all these processes. The archeus, which we may compare with the modern concept of wholeness derived from the roots hel and healing, holds the body together and protects it against detrimental interference. Disease, though it is related to certain causal complexes, the entia morbit, is predominantly suffering within the archeus, and it is the archeus which marshals the powers of recovery. With the first triumphs of pure mechanical science, the concepts of iatrophysis and iatrochemistry arose, according to which life became an easily measurable combination of mechanical and chemical activities. The possibility of curing disease now seemed at last within the grasp of man. It was to be like repairing a machine. Boerhaave shared the same amazement about the universe that Paracelsus had. He was acquainted not only with the old theories of Hippocrates, but also with the discoveries of Galileo, Bacon, and Boyle. His fame, however, rests largely on his being primarily a clinical physician. Boerhaave was a born physician. He brought to his work great force of personality, single-mindedness, and determination, and to this he added an encyclopedic knowledge. He taught that disease must be studied where it actually exists, at the bed of the sick person. If you wish to find out about a disease, he said, it is to the patient that you must go for information. It was this doctrine that Boerhaave taught, and enormous audiences attended his lectures. He was the exponent of no rigid medical theory, collecting the truth from whatever school of medicine it might be found. He was most in sympathy with the iatrophysici, not so much on account of their conceptions, but because of the straightforward method which they used to express their ideas.
Boerhaave, as a clinical eclectic, propounded no explanation of the ultimate causes of diseases. Disease for him was a disturbance of function, and this definition was sufficient for him. He believed that the phenomena of life are mechanical, stating, "When the juices stand still, there is no life. If they flow uninterrupted through the ducts, the body is alive. When we look at a corpse, we may see that all the solid parts, such as are necessary for health, and the liquid parts are present. Only the movement which circulates the juices is not there. As soon as the nerves are excited in one way or another, so as to make the substance which keeps the heart in motion flow again, the sad picture of death disappears and joyful life comes back again. Not only life, but also warmth, color, movement, consciousness, every vital, natural, and human activity. Nothing."
Chapter 4. Unwitching the Witches, the Influence of a Medical Book. One summer, I decided to make a pilgrimage to two little Dutch towns that had meant much to the history of rational medical thinking. Since the international atmosphere was then full of suspicion, prejudice, and sorcery, this was in 1959, I found the thought of visiting the spots where in olden days liberating ideas had been born a comforting one. In 1597, the last witch burning took place in the lowlands, but in other parts of Europe, the pyres of delusion continued to smolder until the beginning of the 19th century. Boschwitz, in his book on the battle against the devil, estimates that more than 1 million people were put to death because of being suspected of having signed a pact with the devil. Why is it that in Holland, the idea of tolerance together with the insight of others' delusions were born so much earlier? Here on the delta of 3 great European rivers, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Schelde, people of various nationalities and cultural backgrounds met and exchanged ideas. We know, for instance, that during the Reformation, much literature that spoke out against old and sacred ideas were smuggled by the skippers of riverboats and ships, who, because of their trade and traffic, had learned to be freer in their thinking. The art of printing had just been simultaneously discovered by Gutenberg in Germany and by Koester in Haarlem. Erasmus of Rotterdam, though still adhering to the Old Church, published biting criticisms of it in his book Laus Stultitia, In Praise of Folly. The growth of protests against the Church in the late 15th century and 16th century led to more rational thinking about such magic, anxiety-provoking fantasies as devils and witches. In addition to this, the Renaissance created the idea of a new, free, unique man, a man with unlimited curiosity, anxious for knowledge, and wanting to be morally responsible to his own conscience only. Even before the physician Dr. Johannes Weir published his book De Praestigiis Daemonum in 1556 on the delusions about demons, there were signs of rebellion in the country against the persecution of witches. From the beginning of the 16th century until late in the 18th century, people from all over Europe went to the little town of Oudewater on the River Yssel in South Holland in order to subject themselves to a weighing test in the official weigh house. Thus being tested, they acquired an official certificate with the seal of the secretary of the town to certify that their official weight was in accordance with the natural proportions of the body. Nothing was officially said about the pros and cons of their guilt of hexing, but those accused of witchcraft were absolved by the fact that they were certified not to be of an unnatural weight or even weightless, these being the greatest evidence of being a witch. Persecution for witchcraft was intensified by the infamous papal bull of Innocence VIII in 1483, which invoked a sacred war against all those who committed incubus and succubus with the devil and his henchmen. The official prosecutors wrote the terrorizing book Malleus Maleficarum, the sledgehammer against the witches, that for years was the textbook for those who thought to burn out man's magic evil of sorcery. Johannes Weir was born in the year 1515 in the town of Grave on the River Meuse. After studying in Paris, he carried on a medical practice in his hometown, and later he settled in Arnhem as the city physician. The last 30 years of his life, he was a physician in the service of the Duke of Jülich and Cleves. He died in 1588. His book On the Delusions About Demons was written when he was still young, most probably when he lived in Arnhem.
He stated in his book that the collective and voluntary self-accusation of women, through which they exposed themselves to torture and death by their inquisitors, was, in itself, an act inspired by the devil, a trick of demons, a conjuration whose aim it was to doom not only the innocent women, but also their reckless judges. Thus, Weir very early formulated the idea of brainwashing. His need to understand symptoms in a rational way brought a revolution in medical thought. Weir was the first medical man to introduce the idea of the sickness of thinking, that later became the common psychiatric concept of delusion and mental blindness. Wherever his book had influence, the persecution of witches gradually ceased, in some countries more than 150 years before the infectious persecutional fury was finally brought to an end throughout the civilized world. Weir's interest in mental diseases and his medical psychological insights became one of the main instruments for fighting the witch delusion and the pleasure in physical torture taken by deluded judges. It is highly unpleasant, he writes, to see how people, in order to kill their own errors, are busy killing human beings. Weir realized even then that witches were scapegoats for the inner confusion and desperation of their judges, and of the zeitgeist in general. He came quite near to the Freudian concept of man projecting his own inner evil onto the scapegoat. Visiting the two little Dutch towns of Grave and Outerwater that were
Part 2. The concept of concept. Clinical epistemology is nearly non-existent. I.e., Roland-Ang chapters attempt to scrutinize some of the marginal problems of general medicine and psychiatry. Emphasis is put on the historical method and the inadvertent use of various epistemologic concepts. For the psychiatrist, the concepts of ambivalence and regression have specific value. Chapter 5. Psychiatry as an historical science. Science is not wisdom. Science is the clear, systematic arrangement of both facts and thoughts so that the wise man may use them. The student who tries to orient himself in psychiatry is confronted by a variety of schools and theoretical currents. One way to begin to examine them may be to give critical attention to what this rather new science of human behavior is not, following Spinoza's advice about the acquisition of knowledge. Omnec determinatio est negatio. Everything is determined by its negative. Careful delimitation is needed in the young science of mental health, and it is perhaps best that psychiatry itself attempts to construct its own epistemologic criticisms. Psychoanalysis has taught us to take careful notice of the individual's limitations of approach. Without understanding his own repressions, frustrations, and intellectual defenses, he may not overcome the subjective blind spots in his everyday observation. And this may, with equal accuracy, be said of a science. This chapter aims to sum up some of the rules of investigation with which psychiatrists knowingly and unknowingly work. Psychiatry, a multidisciplinary science. Psychiatry has a kinship with all the various disciplines that study man and mankind. But, like every science, it seeks to reshape the world under study according to its own systematic deductions. It does not, for example, accept incidents as unrelated occurrences, but looks for primal causes and final aims. Behavioral science is ideally hard, critical research into one's own motivations and those of one's fellow men. Scientific understanding in all fields is related to the intelligent reduction and abstraction of observations, with finding order and predictability in seeming chaos. Although the psychiatric specialty belongs to the medical family, many of its particular insights originate in popular psychology and good common sense. Psychiatry has gathered therapeutic methods from shamans and magicians who, in prehistoric times, used their intuitive knowledge of the human soul to exert power over man. From priests and ministers, psychiatrists have learned to look at human guilt, misery, and sin as part of a system of age-old guiding inner values.
Historians, anthropologists, and social scientists have taught psychiatrists how culture, civilization, and economic production change human habits and influence the aspects of different signs and symptoms. Educators and pedagogues have taught them how human patterns of action in the rearing of children can be dealt with and changed, while general medicine and especially neuropathology have taught doctors the manifold biological roots of human behavior. Only since the 19th century has there been systematic exploration of mental symptoms and mental disease. And because the number of contributing sciences is so great, a clear integration of all the different avenues of approach has not yet been accomplished. That is why people will find many different schools and shades of opinions in conflict, each claiming the one and only truthful explanation of the phenomena under study. Man's compulsion for order and regulation arises from a need for safety and tidiness. Even a tyrannical regime can give a feeling of being at home and in an ordered surrounding. However, scientifically speaking, chaos is only a different kind of order, in which the same mathematical rules of probability are valid. Unwittingly, we include various preconceived premises in our observations. There are also various inadvertent a priori assumptions contained in the questions. Thus, both questioner and question must be questioned. The need to hedge our inquiries and simplify them can be a stumbling block to finding truth and reality. Our thinking has a tendency to become rigid and repetitive in an attempt to shorten the quest for truth by reducing phenomena to one general principle. We say, for example, schizophrenia is caused by X. Yet we know that what we now call schizophrenia can be caused, provoked, or triggered by various factors. While on the other hand, one single pathogenic factor, as for instance alcoholic intoxication.
Chapter 6. Clinical Epistemology. What is epistemology? Science tries to make the unuseful practical and the uncanny comprehensible. Epistemology is the science that aims to criticize and evaluate methods of attaining knowledge and reaching the truth. This implies methodical self-criticism. What the Germans call Erkenntnistheorie, and in this country is sometimes called gnoseology, investigates the theory and methodology of knowledge and bad and good habits of arriving at explanations. Episte, knowledge; logos, study of. Philosophy was long prone to view men as mere rational beings, since it studies varieties of distorted thinking and observes the ways in which primitive and ancient modes of thought continually and unwittingly invade man's logic. Yet psychiatry cannot contribute valuable insights to the theory of knowledge unless it becomes more aware of the instruments of thinking it itself uses. Contrasting theories bombard the psychiatric mind, among which it is impossible to choose critically without awareness of psychiatric epistemology. Philosophy was long prone to view men as rational beings thinking in logical ways. Psychiatry believes that rational man does not know much rationally about himself. Yet, one of the tenets of psychiatry is that disease can be mastered by mere understanding. Epistemology, the science of presuppositions, cannot exist without unchecked presuppositions and a prioris. Even the words we speak and write are conditioned by various historical changes in semantic meaning, subtle changes that may reverberate in the final words we use. A primary epistemologic question is whether there are facts independent from perceptual and observational distortion. Is objective knowledge available? Is it possible for man to overcome distortions in the perception and interpretation of facts? Science is not only the gathering of facts, but seeing facts in a new way, a new order. Modern perception theory states that every perception is distorted by preconditioned anticipation. That is, we partially see what we expect or want to see. We do not perceive directly. A perception is the result of a cluster of stimuli to our senses. By trial and error, we try to verify reality and arrive at the most probable impression. But our actual perception is conditioned by former impressions and perceptions, the memories of which are not consciously available to our minds.
Every perception implies cognitive presumptions, i.e., a priori suppositions about the existence of a reality, rooted in infantile experiences about reality. This mutual interrelation between prejudiced supposition and perception is a dilemma we never completely overcome. In observing reality, man always stands in his own way. Even in physics, there is the interaction between the observer and what is observed. We have to accept the limitations of thinking that tries to understand thinking. According to Gödel's theorem, quoted by Bridgman, no logical system can ever prove that it is a perfect system in the sense that it may not contain concealed self-contradictions. Even the words postulate, axiom, and a priori unwittingly bind our thoughts to a presupposition, to the concept of a beginning, even though the astronomers prefer to talk about continuous creation, a flow of events without beginning and end. No postulate or self-evident proposition is an isolated truth. It is always related to other facts or other systems. It is merely true in relation to something else. Russell. We may distinguish between epistemologic monism and pluralism. Monism pretends that what is perceived and/or remembered is the sole object of knowledge. While data may exist independently of the perceiving and knowing mind, the mind shapes the data. The creative part of us shapes the world. Pluralism supposes that a set of different operations of the mind is active in leading to a common goal of increased knowledge, operationalism. According to modern mathematics, the amount of possible assumptions is infinite. In all meaningless nonsense, rules of regularity can be demonstrated, which sometimes may lead to the discovery of meaningful truths. Practically speaking, pluralism uses the aforementioned herkologic approach, derived from herkos, hedge. Following Spinoza's omni determinate est negatio idea, it tries to delineate the knowable from the unknowable or tentatively unknowable. Pluralism tries to integrate both the rational, deductive, and the empirical approaches to what is knowable, without denying the probabilistic, teleologic, and genetic approaches that are also possible. In pluralism, we distinguish various objective and subjective approaches to the problem of
Chapter 7. Thinking and Unthinking. However closely an individual adheres to one specialized concept of thinking, he also unwittingly uses the theoretical methods of his adversaries. The notion of this inadvertent use of various gestalts of thinking came rather early to me when I was studying philosophy. My teacher, an ardent Hegelian, was well known in professional circles. From time to time, he invited his students to his home for tea, and, in this informal atmosphere, he was completely different from the man we knew in the classroom. He did not speak ex cathedra, but became much more friendly and open, giving us wild explanations about how he had formulated some of his theories. He told us, for instance, that his keenest thinking happened when he was sitting on the toilet creating some biological production. With my newly acquired psychoanalytic sophistication, I related his remarks to some of Freud's biogenetic explanations. About a colleague who was an ardent psychomonist, my professor could never express any appreciation until he had the experience of spending a few days as the man's guest. Then he found himself admiring his host for the huge number of books he possessed. Suddenly, in the midst of a discussion, my teacher would stop and say, "Now I am reasoning just like my theoretical enemies." He was aware that from time to time he unwittingly took over the logic of his adversaries. Most of us do this. We ostentatiously adhere to the concepts we ourselves consciously believe in, but also, often unknowingly, use the thoughts of others. If one were to analyze a tape recording of a discussion carried on at a meeting of philosophers, it would be possible to detect not only the topmost thinking of the speakers, but also the side thoughts in which they unthinkingly adopted the logic of their adversaries. We would note the petty pouting of those who cannot win the verbal battle, the crude materialism of those who use mere weight of voice, the naive idealism of those who stick to one key word, believing that quick words and repartee will convince others. Our keenest thinking is put into action during a discussion, but at the same time, there is a lot of unthinking going on because we are all caught in our own verbal habits, our own ways of argument, our need to oppose, and our reliance on too valued thinking. When I am right, he cannot be right. Thinking as a fetal luxury. The psychologist approaches the process of thinking differently than the philosopher. The former often finds that overemphasis on logic and reason weakens man's ties to reality. Life is not clearly logical and simply determined. Rigid logic only prevails in the rule-ridden world of the insect. Ideas and concepts often spring forth illogically. Idle play, sleep, and other states of partial awareness are fertile soil for the germination of ideas. The determination to think logically is not sufficient for production of thought. The mind requires the creative power of passion to produce. A scrupulous application of the laws of logic and reason is not an adequate guide to the solution of life's problems. Reason merely assists in the avoidance of major errors. The practical question in the world is how to manage unreason. The psychologist looks upon thinking as a mysterious biological luxury largely limited to the human species. It is related to an inhibition of vital functions, replacing instinctual actions, and accompanied by a curious, self-examining consciousness. The anatomist Bulk metaphorically ascribed the peculiar biological inhibitions and retardations of functioning to the erect posture of man, his long youth and dependency, and his never-ceasing play. Because man remains an unprotected fetus for so long, his physical defenses do not develop and differentiate adequately, and his forebrain had the opportunity to develop as a useful instrument of consciousness. Fetalization and retardation in biological development provide man the opportunity for thinking. Thinking as a new adaptation to reality. Jeannette was one of the first to call the attention of psychologists to what he called the reality function, fonction du réel. He speaks of a mental tension and force in man, the highest perfection of which is the reality function. When this tension and alertness diminish, certain mental characteristics disappear. The first quality to weaken is man's capacity for adjustment to changing reality. The immediate experience, insight, and enjoyment of reality is a highly differentiated and vulnerable mental activity. Mature man, confronting reality, must make nearly continual adjustments. Carpe diem, enjoy the day, is a vulnerable function. For many people, enjoyment comes only in remembering an experience while they recount it to others, having been too exhausted or too preoccupied to enjoy a supreme moment when it actually happened. Many thinkers and dreamers.
Chapter 8. Janus and the Concepts of Ambivalence. The concept that man's feeling and thinking are built of contrasting and often opposing principles is a very old one and is called ambivalence or inner polarity. It permeates every Eastern philosophy. This mythologic idea finds its culmination in the Roman god Janus, the two-faced deity. The Arch of Janus was at the Forum Romanum, the place where the suburban roads entered the city of Rome. The opening of the entrance to the Forum Romanum meant war. The closing of the doors signified peace in the Roman Empire. In ancient times, when art, religion, and science were one and the same expression of man's pondering about nature and the universe, man still had the gift of being able to depict in grandiose, intuitive symbols the essence of all that touched his mind. The creative artist expressed feelings and thoughts in his work long before the philosopher could find the means to express them in words. In ancient times, art was the principal communication of intuitive ideas. Immediate intuitive comprehension was accepted by the public as the speech of the gods. Later, man's unity of view and understanding vanished as his cultural and technical specialization increased. But it can be extremely useful to return to those ancient, archaic, intuitive images. For example, the Janus myth provides a background for understanding of man's ambivalence, a word ceaselessly but carelessly used in modern psychology and politics. Usually, by it is meant the inner contrasts, antinomies, and opposites that beset man.
Man's inner hesitation and doubt, the contrasting feelings which give pause to his resolute actions, are remnants of his infantile attempts at adaptation to new circumstances. Man matures very slowly. He is the most dependent animal. A strong ego develops only gradually, and when there is any interruption in or impediment to the process of maturation, a vacillating adjustment remains, in which physical, biologic, and psychologic factors combine to keep the ego, the organ of adjustment, weak and subject to continual oscillation. The double-faced deity. Janus, the deity with two faces, one on each side of the head, is the ancient Roman image which symbolizes the confusing, contrasting aspects in man. Originally, Janus was the god of gates and doors, an expression of the instability and subtle equilibrium of all beginnings. The first hour of the day and the first month after the winter solstice were dedicated to him. We still call the first month of the year January. Janus is the beginning of life, the opener of the gates of the day, and the doorkeeper of heaven. We still call our doorkeepers the janitor. In Christian mythology, the double-faced Saint Michael has the role of bookkeeper and messenger to heaven. The Romans usually pictured Janus with a face at both sides of the head because he looked backward and forward. The origin of all things was ascribed to him, the course of time, the change of seasons, the ups and downs of fortune. He was regarded as the god of good beginning. Fraser, in his elaborate studies on anthropology, explains that the very word door may be derived from the word Janus. His two-faced head symbolizes youth, the beginning, and old age, the end. Later, the concept of Janus also acquired the meaning of deceitful double talk. Originally, however, he was adored as a father god, Dionysus, symbolizing the marriage of several contrasting qualities, fire and water, male and female, the sun and the moon, Dionysus and Diana. Janus as a concept represents an attempt to integrate several older tribal images into one figure, symbolizing the polarity between man and God. The double-faced head represents, in a psychological sense, the awareness of mysterious contrasts in man, that he lives with both God and devil in him. It is the token of man, the erect animal, who can look backward and forward, of man, the watchman of his own history, and of man, the master of time. The name Janus, Diana, is thought to have the same root as Jonas, Hakon, all meaning originally the great light, the great sun-father god. In Oriental culture, the Janus figure is depicted as a male and a female face, or a being that is half human, half animal. And in all cultures, we can find comparable reflections and ponderings about nature and the universe expressed in the mythologic idiom common to the culture and the time. Man's inner experience of being divided and split partially originates from his wonderment about the division of sexes into male and female. An ancient myth holds that once man and woman were not separated, that they were one and undivided being until God separated them. Since then, the ardent urge has existed in man to find his lost counterpart and to merge back.
Psychiatric ambivalence. The psychiatric concept of ambivalence was first developed by the Swiss psychiatrist Bleuler, who noted how often contrasting feelings were expressed nearly simultaneously by mentally sick patients, as, for instance, asynchronous laughing and crying. He distinguished an emotional ambivalence in which opposite feelings confuse man's emotional investment, an ambivalence of will and action, also called ambitendency, in which people seldom can do what they intend to do because of the clash of inner motivations, and an intellectual ambivalence caused by interfering counterthoughts inhibiting or neutralizing any form of creative thinking. Subsequently, Freud enlarged on those concepts. Psychoanalytic theory offers several approaches to the understanding of such inner doubt, confusion, and ambivalence. At first, innate biological bisexuality was seen as the root of ambivalence and polarity. Not only is there an embryologic and anatomic basis for this bisexuality, male and female hormones are, for instance, circulating in every human being, but every child has both a father and a mother to identify with. A dominant inner parental picture may interfere with adequate development. The boy who remains too much identified with his mother will develop female qualities, for example. Later, the Freudian concept of ambivalence was simplified and brought back to a mere fundamental dualistic and metaphysical viewpoint of the contrast between anabolic and catabolic processes, the building and destroying forces in the body, between the life and death instincts struggling in man. Others brought man's inner polarity back to the strange dichotomy between subject and object, or between feeling and thinking. It is sufficient to realize that various polarities can be accused of causing man's hesitations. In psychoanalytic and general psychiatric literature, we find that authors repeatedly refer to ambivalence, quoting Freud's and Bleuler's writings, but little systematic investigation of this basic concept has been made. Unfortunately, personal ambivalence, the prevalence of contrasting and even hostile feelings, tends to confuse many a scientist's mind. The scholar's personal emotions may lead him to very dogmatic approaches to others' theories. We find highly ambivalent, even hostile opinions and feelings expressed about colleagues just as much engaged in research designed to enrich the fundamental knowledge of man. Orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy fight each other as if these archaic dogmatic attitudes were part of the scientific equipment. Fantasied theory battles with scientific discipline, semantic confusion with conceptual ignorance, explanation compulsion with skeptical restraint, intuition with factual description. Behind all this theoretical confusion lies the penetrating question as to whether the structure and general method of our thinking corresponds sufficiently to the nature of what we are investigating. What are our limitations? What do we omit? What do investigators unobtrusively add to what they observe? These are questions philosophers have asked themselves throughout the ages. Ambivalence and polarity. A definition and exact description of the concept of ambivalence or inner polarity are difficult to give, because in studying phenomena of ambivalence, we usually experience the interplay of various contrasting aspects and dual tendencies in what we observe. Perhaps it would be better to speak of polyvalent feelings instead of ambivalence, as various components build up one final feeling. The allegedly opposing feelings of love and hate are in their development quite distinguishable from the aforementioned male-female polarity. The interaction between instinctual drives and their controlling and inhibiting defense mechanisms, though also contrasting in their action, must be regarded quite differently. In order to cope with this semantic dilemma and confusion of opposite forces and tendencies, I propose to consider man's contrasting interactions on different levels of clinical investigation, delaying the question as to what extent we can relate and integrate these different polarities. Before outlining these different levels, however, attention must be directed to that mysterious concept of integration, the makings of things entire and intact. Central in the analysis of the various interacting feelings that are active in the mind-body unit stands man's concept of harmony, of equilibrium and equanimity, of a strong, individual, stable unit. Though there may be contrasting tendencies living in man, the idea is that a gradual integration of such inner antinomies is possible. Man's integrity means that he is in control of the contrasting forces in him. The biological concept of homeostasis, stable physical equilibrium, is assumed to have its counterpart in psychic homeostatic mechanisms, which enable man to face the challenges of life. When either the physical or psychic homeostatic forces fail, man grows ill. Concepts such as synthesis, integration, and homeostasis are also linked to the mysterious spontaneous
Man's bipolar adaptation. Psychologists are on familiar terrain when they survey some of the biological systems of adaptation. Let us, for the sake of simplicity, define feelings as biological alarm signals helping the living unit in its adaptation to outside influences. Every organism, for instance, has to find its way between opposing sensory warning signals, between temperatures that may be too warm or too cold, between stimuli that excite too much or too little, between light that is too bright or too dark, between impressions too painful or not stimulating enough. In lower animals, we speak of adaptation to differently directed tropisms. Gradually, the organism, as a result of the process of learning involving memory, repetition, and time, finds a more stable middle road. It forms its own automatic mode of defense and attack. So does the mind, as we shall see later. It is not preposterous to state that, biologically speaking, the first vacillating bipolar feelings form part of a system of trial adaptation between numerous contrasting alarm signals until the middle road, an even keel of equanimity, is found. Neurophysiologic findings suggest that the organism has different means of adaptation. At birth, the baby has polar neural systems ready to work with. The contrasting actions of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems of internal regulation and adaptation come into action. Via the sensory organs, the newborn's mind is opened to a more abundant reception of stimuli. In contrast to the constancy of the temperature inside the womb, the child now is exposed to things as either too warm or too cold, as signaled to his brain by different neuronal pathways. Formerly indifferent to temperature, suddenly he moves in a bipolar temperature world. Various contrasting biological systems are at work in the service of human adaptation. The skin, for instance, has such a dual function. It serves as an organ of protection and camouflage, but is also able to give alarm signals to fellow creatures, goose flesh, paleness, fright reactions, and serves thus also as an organ of communication. We are acquainted with the function of hormones and antihormones, toxins and antitoxins. Cannon's theory of dual control is based on these facts and led him to develop the concept of homeostasis as an equilibrium between polary functions. It is important for us to be aware of the fact that part of man's ambivalent adjustment and his vacillation between opposite tendencies is rooted in innate biological patterns of adaptation. In every organ, we can find such ambiguities of action, even in the highest differentiated functions. Speech, for example, is not only a tool of communication and contact, but also a tool of camouflage and warding off. To holler or to swaller. Man's emotional and behavioral ambivalence begins developing in him from the very moment he is born. Birth, with its sudden exposure to a hostile world of hunger, cold, and enforced breathing, invokes numerous biological and psychological reactions. Ambivalence starts at birth. Man wants to escape the womb, yet wants to get back to what some theoreticians call the pre-ambivalent world of oceanic feeling and nirvanic equanimity. The picture of life in the womb as a lost paradise is part of our common poetic imagery. I realize the semantic confusion possibly inherent in the expression "wants to go back." We must relate it here to unconscious biological strivings, influenced by the manifold new impressions and intrusions into the mind-body of the newborn. It is this ambivalence of birth and hesitation about departure from the womb we find so often expressed in the ancient symbols expressing man's inner contrasts. Even Buddha is pictured as being born out of the world serpent, the snake representing the danger and the pangs of birth and the rhythmic contractions of the womb. Very soon after this physical separation, accompanied by the mental trauma of being torn away from the nirvanic womb world, another separation occurs, which is even more significant: the growing awareness of an inner world confronting an outer world. Man is no longer the center point of his biological world. He also lives opposite to that world. He is a self-reflective being. He looks at the world. The psychic distance between these two worlds grows with the degree of mental development. We may say that this fundamental antinomy between in and out, between merging and separation, or, to express it in more metaphorical terms, the split in the ancient oceanic undivided union and participation with the mother, incites various defensive reactions to repair the symbiotic schism and to bring these two separated worlds together again. Some babies never outgrow their symbiotic coexistence with their mother. Various psychic processes try to bridge the growing gap. The psychic processes of illusion, introjection, projection, transference, and communication are a part of the reparative process.
Chapter 9. Regression and Regeneration. Sometimes clinicians must step away from the clinic, where they are so often forced to make pressing decisions, and take a new look at some of the concepts they use every day, often without being aware of their varied ramifications.
The fascinating aspect of psychology and pathology is that every concept is related to the entire personality and has ramifications which reach into all that scientists do and think about man. Shortly before the outbreak of World War II, the Dutch historian Jan Romein and the psychoanalyst August Starke had an animated discussion as to which of their respective fields had discovered the importance of the principle of regression and retrogenesis in the service of the development of the individual and of mankind. The historian indicated that the cultural development of mankind has never followed a straight progressive line, but has consisted of a peculiar growth by leaps and bounds. Whereas every human development has the tendency to get caught in the rigid repetition of complicated habits and rituals, consequently, a gradual retardation in development, even a degeneration, may take place. As a secondary result, backward groups and races often have a greater opportunity to develop their inherent vitality and to bypass their culturally fixed neighbors in cultural and technical achievements. The psychoanalyst compared this dialectic development of history with the law of retrogenesis in man's personal development. Every growth occurs through alternating progression forward and regressive backward movements. Especially in psychotherapy, we observe that man, when lost in his neurotic fixations, often has to regress and to set the clock back in order to be able to progress and to revitalize himself. Out of undifferentiated layers of the psyche, new adaptations are formed. The mysterious process of regeneration, on which all cure depends, continually utilizes these backsliding habits of cells and tissues in the service of repair. Regression often takes place in the service of reconditioning and man's renewed planning and futurization. This notion of the usefulness of temporary regression has been known for a long time and is expressed so well in the symbolic saying, reculer pour mieux sauter, walking back in order to jump better. It is not an all-consuming law, but a pattern of behavior that may occur either as a step in the service of renewal and regeneration, or as one leading to a final degradation and decline. The subject of mental regression is important because people slip back rather easily into states of primitive, uncontrolled behavior, such as we see in riots and panics. In the political sphere, it is much easier to make people regress than progress. The manipulators of psychological warfare try to make use of collective regression to mold the masses into a desired pattern. Every form of regression appeals to a deep-seated inner need of man, the need to become again the untamed animal or the helpless baby. This is one of the reasons why regressive behavior is so much more seductive and contaminative than civilized, restrained behavior. In a study on communication and interaction, I could describe more extensively how man's regressive archaic signs and movements induce others to co-oscillate, as it were, with the inductor. Mental contagion and its implications make the study of the meaning of regression doubly important. All organisms under stress and duress tend to assume a more primitive and less differentiated way of living. We saw a recent example of this when primitive organisms and tissues were placed within a space capsule and sent off on a journey through the radiation belt. When the capsule was retrieved, the tissues were found to be in a state of physiological death, a kind of defensive incystation and hibernation. We encounter a similar form of protective mock death in man, in the ultra-passive feign or faint reaction to sudden fright. It is the organism's attempt to merge, as it were, with its surroundings in order to be unobserved by predator and fate. Clinically, this rigid assimilation and camouflage reaction is called catalepsy and is in its most extreme form seen in both catatonia and hypnotic catalepsy. Sometimes such a form of mock death can lead to real death, as was observed in voodoo death and in war panic. In our context, we may say that regression often serves as a defensive device to stress, but can overshoot the mark. In general, we may distinguish 4 different behavior reactions to stress, danger, and fear. 1. A general regression. Both the phylogenetic and ontogenetic clocks are turned back. This is the reaction that will mainly interest us in this chapter. 2. The feign or faint reaction in mock death and camouflage, in which the phylogenetic clock is turned back. 3. The fight or flight reactions as seen in panic and fury. With these, clinicians are most familiar. 4.
The feel or fool reactions, the results of ontogenetic regression. The organism, conditioned by its environment to specific emotional disguises and responses, displays in every new stress some of.
Part 3. The concept of therapy. The following chapters try to investigate various postulates unwittingly used in daily clinical work. Special emphasis is put on the negative illness and the analysis of the therapeutic action, which brings us back to general medicine. The following chapters try to apply the eclectic method to the problem of malignancy, normality, and psychopathy. Chapter 10. Professional preoccupations, illusions, and prejudices. The statistical preoccupation. When investigators search for generalizations and seek the ultimate in wisdom by studying large numbers of patients, they usually get out of their research only what they inadvertently put into it. The greater the number of patients, the less emphasis on unique, individual factors. A statistical study finds only that which can be expressed in numbers. It investigates quantities, not qualities. True, we need figures of probabilities for the prediction of future events. But inside the atom, other rules reign. About the probabilities reigning inside the individual psyche, statistical studies give us nearly no information. Psychiatry is often involved in statistical expressions of normality, intelligence, and adjustment. Yet, there are other values which cannot be shown in statistical averages. For example, the sense of honesty and truth, the need for moral values and self-control, the preservation of man's dignity, the liberation from prejudices about fellow men and their scientific methods. To the statistician, every reduction of an unexplained variation to a general rule becomes an explanation. This is not so for the historian or the psychologist, since they also must study the uniqueness of the event. Beside this, facts never speak for themselves. They must be interpreted by the human mind. Facts are already translations of presumptions. One single well-observed case can often teach us more than statistically computed facts, particularly about the interrelationships of many coincidental factors which may explode into a disease. For instance, one well-observed case of spontaneous cure of cancer, there exist 79 in the literature, shows us that there are curative factors against cancer present in the mind-body unit that have not been studied as yet. Every occurrence represents a unique and coincidental meeting of many known and unknown factors. And the very structure of that coincidence may have a particular meaning in the life of the sick human being. There are no sure prognoses in medicine, but only probable trends. Even physics tells us that the future is determined within a defined area of uncertainty, Bronowski. The worship of large numbers, quantity, and tabulation obscures a great deal of clinical, medical, and psychiatric observation. There even exists already a habit of pseudo-exactitude by fortifying one's point by too many quotations, quotation mania, and overabundance of clinical notes to make one's point. Clinical experiences and wisdom have become for many merely a statistical factor. Many scientific articles, for instance, are written by groups of doctors as if the number of writers increased the likelihood of finding the truth. The incidental, well-interviewed and well-observed clinical case threatens to disappear from literature, while the catchword research attracts young investigators to laboratories and hospitals having vast experience. Even psychoanalysts want to express their impact and therapeutic success in terms of statistical figures, as if they could not prove the importance and the quality of their work without the bolstering of numbers. In psychiatry, it is specifically the one case that teaches us something about the meaning of crisis and change in man. His ethical concepts and moral aims are not quantifiable and cannot be measured. No opinion poll measures moral value, only a lack of moral awareness. The computer as a possible future tool. Nevertheless, as investigators, we need well-applied statistical evaluation, through which the measurable, quantifiable facts can be evaluated.
The fast computing capacity of the digital computing machine can be of great help for the processing the multitudes of data available to scientists. An additional function of the computer will be that it will give a quick survey of the huge number of problems involved. The computer is not only used to simplify and increase the speed of calculations, but it can also be used as a means to prevent the methodical reductions we unwittingly apply in the experimental setting. The computer has a tremendous storage capacity of historical data, showing us the wide range of problems belonging to one single observed fact. Computers will help us to review our system of clinical classification.
Chapter 11. Some clinical data and their postulates. The acquisition of some psychiatric data. Which are the various psychiatric data we usually take into consideration during the first encounters with patients? The factors mentioned as causes for neuroses and psychoses can also be detected in normal people. Obviously, the nuclear essences of deviations are more structural than factual. I tentatively give this survey of data to be explored to emphasize the difficulties involved, since many of these data are as yet not measurable, quantifiable, or verifiable, and, as noted before, some will perhaps never will be. Facts and data influence our experiences, but they are not identical with our experiences. New experiences are preconditioned and distorted by a huge range of former experiences, by conscious and unconscious mnemic impressions continually verifying and distorting the outside world. Ecologic data. The interaction between different social groups, between the individual and his family unit and the larger environment, needs a great deal more study. Parts and wholes of culture and society are historical realities, subject to mental contagion and social interaction. The study of mental contagion and emotional contamination gives better information about cultural, social, and psychological etiology of abnormal behavior. Researchers have studied the smaller psychic parts acting isolatedly in the individual, e.g., the psychic complexes, the reflections of tradition, dogma and ideology, public opinion, and some specific early identifications, and the introjects. But the individual is also bound to various social groups. He is part of a collective as well as an individual. Genetic data. Although the number of accurately diagnosed cases from former generations which we can take into account is few, we hope in the future to learn more from the observation of cell nuclei and chromosomes about the heredity of metabolic deviations. For some of the hereditary diseases, pure predictions can already be made concerning influences on mental processes. Psychogenetic data. Psychoanalysis has made us acquainted with the impact of special developmental phases on the total person. In these phases, the growing person is more vulnerable to specific conditioning. Clinically, we may distinguish the following phases. 1. The impact of orality, to holler or to swaller. 2. The impact of teething, the advent of oral sadistic tendencies, the guilt of aggression. 3. The impact of anality. Physiologic evacuation can be conditioned into passive retentive hoarding or active soiling and defiance. Doubt about the body easily arises. 4. The impact of the walking crisis. The problem of separation and independence is involved, the freedom of curiosity, and the incorporation of parental concepts. 5. The impact of body functions. Defecation, urination, and masturbation in the service of tension relief. 6. The impact of the Oedipal phase. Sexual attachment as a weapon of domination or rivalry. The guilt of transgression of sexual taboos. 7. The impact of the third milieu. The transition to school and the community of peers leads to new problems. Learning leads to greater distance from parental protection. New group formation takes place in the service of both cooperation and prejudice toward outsiders. 8. The impact of menstrual onset and second genital phase. 9. The impact of sexual maturity. 10. The impact of profession and professional status. 11. the impact of mental infection or psychic contagion. In the here mentioned different phases of development, various periods of greater vulnerability to communication and mutual persuasion exist. The more common regression, the more mutual mental contamination takes place. Being in the same phase of psychic development leads to easier mutual reverberations of emotions. The psychosomatic approach. The clinical use of the word psychosomatic does not reflect on the old epistemologic problem of the relation between psychological and physical phenomena, while it does imply a criticism of the barren philosophical approaches about an all-or-none pre-stabilized harmony between the two. The word now refers to a multiple view of the problem of psychophysical relations in reference to actual behavioral and clinical phenomena. In other words, it is an operational answer to the old theoretical question. Psychosomatic medicine merely implies a clinical working hypothesis without reflecting too much on the ancient theories of psychophysical parallelism. Your author tends to subscribe to Whitehead's reduction of this ancient dilemma. Chapter 14. Variable Individual Tolerance. Subjective Attitude of the Therapist. Because so much of therapy of everyday nervous complaints is interwoven with the prescription of different drugs, a study of some of the pitfalls in their use is not out of place. Strict psychotherapy and psychoanalysis should be carried out without any chemical magic. But I know several therapists who make favorable use of drugs at the peak of difficulties with mentally disturbed patients. Especially in older persons, the combination of medication and psychotherapy can be of considerable help. The automatic prescribing reflex makes us accustomed to looking on the human organism as a machine which always reacts in the same way. Often, however, especially in psychotherapy, a drug acts favorably when the patient wants it to, or leads to an opposite result when he unconsciously wants to make trouble. I have observed alcoholic patients in such a state of anger and resistance that they gladly competed with the antabuse they had taken and drank alcoholic beverages in spite of the symptoms they provoked. Their unconscious aim was to prove that the therapist's influence on them was baloney and that they were stronger than every medical magic or restriction. The intricate relationship between medication and the therapist who prescribes it is largely unexplored. The doctor-patient relationship plays a tremendous role in the final result. During World War II, there were many examples of how approved methods worked well for one physician and badly for another. A case in point is the application of narcoanalysis. Some doctors failed to elicit unconscious material no matter what amount of barbiturates, sodium amytal, they injected, while other therapists discovered that without barbiturates and with slight suggestion, the soldier cooperated in everything, even in the analytic theory of narcoanalysis. The provider of medicaments often plays just as important a role in a drug's action as the chemical action of the drug itself. Especially when new drugs are introduced in therapy, the physician must recognize his own emotional investment in their success, the confidence and enthusiasm he transfers unobtrusively to the patient. In the doctor's attitude, we find the reason that so many forms of therapy gradually lose their impact. When the new drug becomes routine, the patient no longer gets any love out of it. It is possible to give some clinical rules concerning the paradoxical and intolerant reactions to alcohol and other sedative drugs. For practical purposes, I mention alcohol, barbiturates, amphetamines, antihistamines, and ataraxics in one breath, because they are all used to influence the central nervous system and they are prescribed in the most confusing combinations. Reactions of variable tolerance and idiosyncrasy are of great social importance because of the accidents that follow in their wake and the unexpected criminal behavior that may result. Many highway accidents are related not to alcohol abuse, but to paradoxical reactions to antihistamines and ataraxics. With all drugs, human susceptibility to intoxication can vary within wide limits. Even the same person may react differently to the same drug at different times.
Although we know a few facts about the physiologic background of this varying behavior, there is little literature on the subject. Wilder's rule that the initial situation and initial value rules the effect of the drugs must be applied here. Coincidental action of different drugs. In the age of aspirin and increasing addiction, the magic act of swallowing has become such a habit that medical control of different pharmacologic actions which fortify or counteract each other is rather difficult. We see this especially in the alcoholic, who also takes barbiturates or antihistamines or ataraxics. One of my patients, an extremely intelligent physician, became even more ataxic than before and caused a car accident as a result of his bad pharmacologic judgment. In the clinical study of the action of narcotic drugs, we often observe the phenomenon of variable tolerance. A patient who previously had normal tolerance for sedation suddenly overreacts. This happens frequently in chronic users of barbiturates. Such a drug addict may unexpectedly show signs of deep sedation after taking his usual dose for so-called mental stimulation. In toxicomaniacs, the addicts, we repeatedly observe this inconstant reaction to drugs. The idiosyncratic reaction may look like a suicide attempt and is often labeled as such because the chronic addict, for an unknown reason, falls into a deep coma without having increased his usual dosage. Let us consider the chronic alcoholic. He has usually reached a rather high tolerance not only for alcohol but also for pharmacologically related narcotics such as ether and chloroform.
Chapter 13. The Therapeutic Action. In this chapter, an analysis of curative motivations and directions as mostly used in physical medicine is attempted because the combination of these known and unknown factors constitutes the therapeutic art and action. Distinction is made between 1. The scientific therapeutic indication based on logic but often leading to too mechanical thinking, 2. The suggestive indication influenced by the emotional needs of the patient and his environment, and 3. The subjective indication based on subjective needs and motivations of the therapist. The art of therapy involves much more than applied scientific deduction. A deplorable difference exists between the physician who wants to heal and the scientist who seeks only to make a diagnosis to give the disease its right name. When the acute emergency of disease forces immediate intervention, the diagnostic intellect hesitates, but the therapeutic instinct often acts even before thinking. The medical student is chiefly taught extensive diagnostic knowledge. He knows many different strange diseases, but he is not given much instruction about the subtle art of healing. He must teach himself that therapeutic ability later. A synthesizing science of the therapeutic arts does not even exist at present. Pharmacology, immunology, and surgery are only specific physical and chemical introductions to such sciences of therapy. Systematic psychotherapy is just in its beginning stages. Because we still lack a general and unifying science of therapy, medical science is burdened with a tragic conflict that may often lead either to therapeutic disbelief and nihilism or to doing too much. This is certainly not the aim of medicine. Many a young physician as well as the public speaks with disdain of ampules, powders, tablets, pills, lotions, and ointments. He is derogatory of surgical operations and psychoanalytic treatments. The public, with its naive criticism or affirmation of various kinds of therapy, forces many doctors to act according to its subjective wishes. The drug manufacturer often tries to suggest to the physician what therapeutic medication to prescribe. Quacks and shamans utilize the lack of systematic study of therapeutic skills to introduce their magic routines. Much of the therapeutic action will depend on the subjective attitude of the doctor toward his patient and on the latter's need for specific medical intervention, thus forcing the doctor to follow certain lines of therapy. Modern psychology knows more about this mutual relationship between doctor and patient. Many patients get better only because they wish to please their physicians or because their physicians do not fit into their neurotypical strategy.
When the physician asks himself if it is time to act, to do something rather than wait for spontaneous regeneration, the vis medicatrix naturae, the natural curative forces, he carefully studies pathologic symptoms and other signs and indications that will determine his therapy. Nature has presented the symptoms of illness. Now comes the therapist to alleviate the illness. The physician places skill and science in opposition to the processes of disease. Bleuler, in his book on medical thinking, questions specific kinds of immediate and hasty therapeutic responses, the furor sanandi. The physician's compulsion to cure implies that he wants to give treatment per se, without asking the question if such healing intervention is really needed. Almost no physician exercises so-called udana therapy, doing nothing, or prescribes placebos on behalf of conscious medical abstention, letting nature find its own way. Apart from the fact that most patients would not allow it, there exists a reflex to do something to turn the natural course of healing in a magic way. If a physician does not immediately prescribe an antibiotic or a sedative, many patients will go to another physician. The various therapeutic activities make real knowledge of disease more and more difficult because in actual life we now rarely encounter untreated, clear-cut symptoms. The result is that our knowledge of a disease is often blurred by the hasty medication, provoking new symptoms. Before the disease is diagnosed, an antibiotic or a painkiller is given. We live in an age of iatrogenic diseases, and besides this medication, too often serves to fortify man's passivity and escapist behavior. The medical school teaches many definite indications for special treatments. Not being mature in his medical thinking, the student must follow these sharp teachings or risk error. This educational suggestion gives the idea of a stable form of pathology and therapy, but it does not, however, agree with the ever-changing picture of reality. Is the rigid indication of therapeutic action wrong? No, we need this form of well-defined medical prescription in emergency cases, but it is...
Chapter 12. The negative illness of not being able to be ill. In the course of their medical training, physicians-to-be are thoroughly indoctrinated with the symptoms of hypochondriasis, the neurotic disease of those trying to make themselves more and more dependent by producing more and more complaints about themselves. But medical students are not made nearly so familiar with the often encountered contrasting syndrome of the denial of disease. Practically speaking, we can observe in almost every illness either an overemphasis or a minimization of symptoms. As time goes on, many physicians, for instance, tend to pay less and less attention to their own symptoms, since their patients are so demanding of their time. This emotional stress, in addition to the physical stress of their lives, may lead to collapse as a result of continual tension, and to coronary occlusion. The amount of coronary disease is 3 times greater among general practitioners than among dermatologists and pathologists. Russick. Man in his struggle for life can use in his defense against pathology either the strategy of overemphasis or that of minimization. He can try to throw his burden of fears and pains onto his fellow men and look for greater protection through self-pity. Or he can flaunt his symptoms, jeer at protection, and haughtily deny any care for himself. This latter group of people cannot admit that they too are sometimes weak. They have to show constantly what heroes they are, for they never give in to pain or feelings of discomfort. Sometimes they tyrannize others with their heroism, as hypochondriacs do with their pains. We meet people who are always ailing and others who are never sick because they are either healthy or they are unable to be ill. In both extremes, we discover the same rigid, compulsive pattern of mental defense. These people refuse to give the body a chance to adapt itself or to be immunized, the one through continual or occasional regression and escape into the fantasy of increasing weakness.
The other, by denying the organism the opportunity to overcome stress by withholding the temporary rest and regression which the body needs in the service of regeneration. There exists, for various reasons, a great difference in susceptibility to illness. The processes of immunization, allergization, and learned adaptation to stress play an important role in the frequency of disease. It is difficult to separate here the individual somatic constitution from the environmental and psychic influences. During a flu epidemic, for instance, there is greater social tolerance of giving in to one's subjective complaints because the epidemic suggestion allows for a maximization of symptoms. Statistically, it has been proved that more than 60% of the mild flu and common cold cases occur on Blue Monday. The factor of subjectively giving in is just as important as the existence of an infecting virus. We all know people who break down their resistance to disease by continually giving in and escaping more and more frequently into their bed of apathy, while their strong brethren can equally undermine their own resistance by compulsively going on and arrogating to themselves a high level of personal health until a sudden mental crisis, a coronary attack, or an intestinal hemorrhage reveal their inner exhaustion. In order to better understand man's denial mechanism in relation to illness, we have to see it as part and parcel of our psychic development. In the initial phase of psychic experience, that which is not perceived simply does not exist, and that which is perceived, e.g. the feeding breast or the suffocating mucus of the nose, acquires exaggerated meaning. Perception and apperception are only possible through verification with the former image. What one does not know, one cannot properly perceive. Former non-recognition or denial, or an erstwhile magical illusion about things to be perceived, will influence an individual's later perceptions. In the formation and perception of every image, man stands, as it were, in his own shadow. This is equally true for the conception of his own illnesses. The clearest example of disease-denying behavior can be found in patients with cerebral damage who not only refuse to acknowledge the symptoms and disability produced by the brain lesion, but emphatically deny many former stressful experiences in life. This syndrome, called anosognosia, is attributable to not only the functional lack caused by the cerebral lesion and subsequent unawareness, but also to an elaborate, passive attempt to overcome the resulting shock.
Chapter 17. The concept of psychopathy. The study of the history of any concept shows that even though we think we have conquered old prejudices, they are still hidden behind the actual words we use. Let us look at the various suggestions that intrude into the concept of psychopathy. The words psychopathic and neurotic are used in everyday life as popular terms, more to express something deprecatory and inferior about a character quality in a person one does not like, than to indicate a semantic and clinical category. This derogatory meaning of the words is more characteristic of European psychiatry than of American psychiatry, where there has been an attempt to limit their meaning to a simple, non-judgmental description of early distortion of growth. The psychiatric origin of the word psychopathic derives from J.L.A. Koch's book, Die psychopathischen Minderwertigkeiten, published in 1891, in which the notion of an incurable, fixed, inferior Anlage of the human being was put forward. Koch described the psychopath as an incidental modification of the Homo sapiens living without inner normative value. Kurt Schneider, who later wrote one of the most elaborate surveys on psychopathy in Aschevenberg's Handbuch der Psychiatrie, 1923 and 1941, attacks the subjective statistical evaluation by the psychiatric observer. What we call normal usually consists of the colorless cross-section of qualities. Kraepelin described psychopaths as human beings with inhibited growth and development, either intellectually or emotionally.
His thorough attempt to find rubrics and labels made psychopathy a static concept for all unsanctioned behavior not fitting into other rubrics. Bleuler, in his textbook of psychiatry, gives a definition of psychopathy as either a hereditary deviation or a changed development caused by mild cerebral disease. He also calls the psychopathies the situational psychoses, because there is always a social trigger revealing the short circuit underneath. The intellect is usually intact, but the emotional life is abnormal, though not completely psychotic. The abnormality manifests itself in an infinite variety of shades and combinations. These early descriptions of psychopathy included the various forms of neurotic acting out of early character disorders, which we understand better now and which are not so difficult to handle therapeutically as is psychopathy. Bleuler also mentioned the narcissistic trends, the increased sensitivity to excitement, and the general lack of moral judgment in the psychopath. The often ill-defined and unacknowledged postulates of human evaluation of normal and abnormal play an important role in the definition of psychopathy, in which continually changing cultural and social values are unwittingly included. This is why the term sociopathic personality disturbance is gaining more currency, for it acknowledges the unknown of the individual-group relation, which may trigger the dormant psychopathic state. In defining psychopathy, a disharmonic development of the personality structure, an environmental educational factor, was emphasized almost from the beginning, Schneider. But the question of how to define harmonic, disharmonic, and distorted development of man had to be left to later psychodynamic interpretation. Another early definition by Kraepelin was widened to include the impulsivity and periodicity of psychopathic acting out, which Janet later condensed in the labels psycholepsy, psycholeptic crisis, and chute mentale. The sudden outburst of rage is for Janet the most important criterion. The older French psychiatrists even called this rage the psychic equivalent of epilepsy, the weakness of the will not being able to control the crude impulses. Various postulates going into the concept. I agree with Karp, who has written one of the latest handbooks on psychopathy, that the subject of psychopathy has to be approached from various norms and evaluations, biologically, genetically, psychosomatically, ethically, socially, and even aesthetically. Only by catching the subject of research in such a network of approaches do we arrive at a clearer insight into the heterogeneous group of psychopathic deviants who are so extremely harmful to the community and themselves. In psychiatry, it has been not only the lack of knowledge of epistemologic postulates that obscured the concept of psychopathy, but various other theoretical and prejudicial intrusions. From the very beginning, though not always defined as such, psychopathy was looked upon as an unchangeable trait, a fixed personality disorder, with all its therapeutic limits.
Those values that come from the superego, after having been taken over and absorbed as moral values from educators, society, and church, have the tendency to be viewed as absolute norms. People stand up for them and do not want to exchange them for new values because once, during their development, these normative values served as a protection against anxiety. There exist values that serve as protection against the instincts, and there are values steeped in the instinctual needs. Values, in contrast to facts, cannot be studied by inductive methods. They have to be historically deducted and found out by empathy and sympathy. This may lead to an inner conflict about values. What people want for themselves often is in conflict with the social values and needs of the community. Which are man's true hopes and values, and which are artificially implanted in him? Usually, the conflict of motivations and values is not known to the person because too easily the process of self-justification creeps in order to deny the real motivation. During World War II, I had to investigate several people who refused to do military service on ethical grounds.
In several, I found a strong horror of the eventual release of their own destructive aggressiveness. It is important to realize that the feeling of responsibility is continually intruded upon by man's value systems. There are those asserting their own values and those who evaluate continually by proxy, asking themselves only what others will think of them. There are others who have no liking for anybody, no interest, no emotional investment in people and the world, and will never take any responsibility. We can call these pathologic cases, but they throw a sharp light on how man's responsibility is continually shaped by his system of values. Responsibility to one's own moral standards and evaluations. This bears a close relationship to the previous category, but needs elaboration, for the conflict between individual conscience and collective moral evaluation is a very subtle daily occurrence. The core of the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann trial involves the question of whether individual conscience prevails beyond automatic submission to orders given when the orders are in conflict with moral principles. Little forms of self-betrayal occur often in daily life. Imagine being in a small, intimate circle in which an absent individual is being slandered, as is often done to get rid of surplus hostility. Under such circumstances, it is difficult for one to break from the temporary collective mood and defend the absentee. A tragic example of this is what happened during the French Revolution to a close friend of Louis XVI. A member of the National Convention, he realized in horror one day that in the heat of the collective mood, he had voted for the beheading of his former king. He committed suicide. Giving in to the collective evaluation out of prudence and safety is a common act of self-betrayal. The process of self-corruption and personal myopia is continually occurring, especially when people are tired. There exist self-justifications that continually nag away at our feelings of responsibility. There is the self-righteousness, bigotry, the infectious defamation of others, the moral contagion of prejudice, the unacknowledgement of our shames and personal wrongs, the narrowing of our outlook, the weapon of false indignation, the collectors of injustice, the toleration of immoral actions for so-called strategic reasons, the need to simplify complicated issues and to use convenience. Many people refer to as conformity what is really a giving up of any critical moral evaluation. In general, we may say that man is responsible for the example he is to others by his own life. He cannot preach morality without living it. Responsibility for repressed tendencies. Although the legal profession looks rather doubtfully at the modern psychological concept of unconscious guilt about hidden crimes, in clinical practice, we find it one of the most frequent motivations for committing minor crimes and for being irresponsible. The unsocial act and petty crime try to sidetrack the deeper-seated hidden feelings of guilt through a continual quest for either punishment or for other forms of self-destructive behavior. A girl who was expelled from college for petty stealing had a double aim in her unsocial behavior. She wallowed in self-pity because of the great injustice done to her, while on a deeper psychic layer, she soothed her guilty audible feelings about her father. At the same time, the verdict brought her back home, the real scene of her crime, in wanting to steal her father's love from her mother. Paradoxical responsibility. This is partly related to the previous point, but I want especially to emphasize the need in many people.
Chapter 16. Responsibility and Normality. An inquiry into the mentally. The word responsibility is used with various meanings and intentions by different people. At one pole, it is a behavioristic term and, as such, lends itself to clinical investigation. At the other pole, it is a value-expressing ideal behavior. But because of its normative content, it is dependent on and related to various cultural and social evaluations. I may call this study a psycholinguistic approach because my emphasis is on the variety of meanings condensed into one and the same word.
This kind of operational research has the value of approaching a problem from various angles, thereby increasing the probability that the core of the problem will be grasped. The semantics of responsibility. A mother scolded her 3-year-old daughter for being irresponsible when the little girl told her a childish fantasy. Yet this fantasy was the child's first response to a world of mystery. What a confusion of words we are in already! In daily life, the word responsible is used in such multifarious ways that an investigation of how the word and its synonyms are used places us directly in the midst of psychological involvements. Since the word contains a condensation of the history of its various meanings, the usages of the past reverberate in every expression of the word. This fact justifies the use of a psycholinguistic approach. Responsibility is derived from spondere, to speak or to pledge. And with the prefix, respond means to speak back and to answer. In order to be responsible, one must be able to be the sponsor of one's own thoughts. It requires the highest rationality of being able to verbalize and explain the feelings and thoughts that are in one's mind. The word is also related to the French épouser, getting married, to speak out who your mate is and to be committed to him or her. In a social sense, responsibility means being able to give an answer to the questions asked. In Dutch, verantwoorden. The primitive or the child who is not yet able to speak cannot be responsible. He cannot give account, cannot answer a charge, and therefore is not to be held answerable and accountable. In German, jemand anrechnen. In terms of developmental psychology, the functions of responding, answering, and accounting are not present in early childhood. The act cannot be verified. Another synonym is imputability, from the Latin imputo, and our word pure, making someone responsible for his dirty and guilty act. Here too, we detect a psychological developmental root, so well expressed in the Dutch equivalent verschoonbaarheid, meaning, is the person able to cleanse himself, to keep the body clean? Originally, it also meant cleansed by fire through divine ordeal, purged from being putrid. The words imputation and reputation have the same root. Imputability now has the meaning, can the person be legally punished? What is his guilt and culpability? Is there awareness of the imputable act? Are the acts he did amendable? Amendability and amenability are expressions for responsibility more frequently used in Great Britain. They show the root mend, the ability to better and repair the omission or the faulty deed, though they express a more general meaning of being under the law. Amends are the compensations and satisfactions one gives to those hurt. An older derivation is from the Latin minari, to threaten, the ability to be led. Amenable means to be easily led and is related to our word demeanor. In trying to judge someone's responsibility, the problem of how he can be led and influenced plays an important role. From an economic standpoint, one arrives at the question of a man's standing surety for debts, liability and reliability. Liability itself is derived from the Latin ligare and religare, being bound to group and faith, and thus it has a religious undercurrent. Liable means liable to group values, but also to guilt and culpability. Liable to penalty, in German Haftbarkeit. Responsibility can be disclaimed by the person in question. He denies and negates the social relation and obligation by not responding, not giving account, by pretending not to be aware, or by truly being non compos mentis. The question of mental competence during an act or during the period of judgment and trial came into being late in history. Even today, there is much confusion when, in a criminal case, for instance.
Chapter 15. Psychological Problems Related to Malignant Growth. This chapter on the psychology of malignancy is designed to show specifically the eclectic approach to a medical problem. The assumption that there is a relation between cancer and the psyche is very old.
especially in the years during which hypnotic therapy was at its high point at the end of the 19th century, much literature existed about their interconnection. The fact that deep hypnosis could influence some of the symptoms like pain and exudation induced many a scientist to draw conclusions too early. The first time I became acquainted with the belief in the interconnection of emotional disturbances and malignancy was as a medical student, now 40 years ago, after reading Grodek's classic The Book of the Id. This fascinating, semi-popular book, which even moved Freud to accept the concept of the id, touches fundamental problems of biology and pathology which we are still in the process of exploring. Grodek's concept of the id goes far beyond what psychoanalysis calls the unconscious. Modern biologists would call it the goal-seeking prime mover of life that regenerates itself, keeps itself in equilibrium, and shows in its highest structural evolution self-awareness and planning toward its innate goals. It is not the theory which is relevant here, but the fact that Grodek sees in the change of the prime structuralization of dead energy one of the causes of cancer. By intuition, he touches on the problems of disturbed equilibrium between cell and environment, of distorted coordination of living structure, of distorted libidinal urges as expressed in changed hormonal circulation. In the later notes on regression, point 10, I come back to what this may imply for further study. Much of our medical bias is conditioned by our first practical experiences. One of my first psychiatric patients was sent to me in order for me to convince her that an operation for sarcoma of the jaw was indicated. She had refused surgical treatment because she wanted to die her own death. I was not able to convince this patient, but in the course of our psychotherapeutic explorations, the tumor disappeared spontaneously, although biopsy had shown it to be malignant. Our mutual astonishment was tremendous. What really had taken place, I do not know, although many theories could be and were proposed. A wrong histologic diagnosis was the most often expressed opinion, but this did not explain the peculiar clinical symptoms and microscopic picture. I can only say that a problem with its full implications was aroused. The aim of this study is to give a survey of the different psychological aspects of the problem of malignancy. How do mind and body interrelate with each other in this field of pathology? Such a survey has a double purpose. It acquaints us with the often subtle and paradoxical results produced when fear and prejudice confuse the patient, but in addition, it may give the doctor some clues to the study of malignant growth. In biology and pathology, there is never a single agent that causes a disease, though sometimes one factor may be the principal trigger causing the outbreak. The fact that in the following only the psychological factors are explored does not imply that these factors constitute the principal etiologic ones. I am aware of the fact that too much emphasis on psychology and subjective factors may be just as disturbing to many a scientist as total neglect of this aspect may be for the psychotherapist. However, I had the amazing experience, when talking to surgical audiences on this subject, that several surgeons tended to go further than I did in the acceptance of the emotional etiology of cancer. In a former publication written jointly by Zeckel and myself, we divided the problems into the following three categories. 1. Cancer knowledge and cancer prejudice. There exists a subjective attitude exhibited by the patient, his family, the physician, and the greater social environment. To this chapter belongs, for instance, the dangerous delay of treatment, the detour to quacks, the need for adequate public education, and the paradoxical action of cancer phobia. 2. Cancer horror related to fear of death and castration. There exists for the patient a less apparent emotional and symbolic meaning of the special organ that is invaded by malignancy. Very specific nightmares are aroused depending on the invaded organ. The reactivation of infantile fantasies about mutilation and fear of mutilation cause a special psychopathology of the cancer patient. 3. The psychosomatic concept of cancer.
This category implies the study of the purely psychological trigger mechanism or the possible physicochemical and psychological interactions. Numerous problems of this character make
Chapter 20. Principles active in mental cure. The importance of surveying various principles active in mental therapy is that it brings us back to the epistemologic concept of multiple approach, the best approach we can use when we are without one straightforward, verifiable measure of evaluation. In clinical interaction with the patient, the therapist uses the same knowledge of personal bias and prejudices as does the observer in physical science. Critics sometimes use the word eclecticism in a negative sense, reproaching an author for a colorless affirmation of contrasting opinions, many of which cannot be true at the same time. It is true that there are people who want to encompass all theories because they have no opinion of their own, but the wish for a multiple approach can also stem from an honest desire to understand differences and integrated concepts. The importance of practical psychotherapy is not merely the treatment and active help given, but also that it provides a continual control of theoretical concepts. Our daily work is the ultimate check on what we think about patients and their neuroses. There is a mutual relation between this work and our changing concepts. Regeneration. With reference to principles of cure and recovery, every branch of medicine is aware that cure starts because of the action of a nearly mystical force, the autogenerative life force. No therapy is possible without this spontaneous self-healing force that is active in all that is alive. Regeneration is the innate steering force of repair and growth toward health. The inborn organizing ability, recognizable, for instance, in the functions of tissue repair, integration, and coordination. There even exists an ecstatic inner awareness of the return of these forces. Every sick person who recovers has at some time experienced this ecstasy. The concept of homeostasis, equilibrium-seeking life forces, is not sufficient to explain the self-piloting life forces, which try to press beyond equilibrium toward an optimum of function. Sometimes there exists a marrow equilibrium of forces that is easily broken down. Sometimes a large and stable equilibrium that is more tolerant and resistant to dangers. Increased tolerance capacity is the most important part of cure in psychotherapy. Sometimes we refer to this regained stability as morale, sometimes as man's mental backbone, sometimes as his health capacity. We may also call it the innate drive and tendency to greater stability and perfection of function. In psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, the real healing and cure take place because of the liberation of spontaneous forces of recovery and regeneration. These forces are the source of our therapeutic confidence. When we review in this chapter the various other influences observed in working with patients, it should be remembered that they are all additional and stimulative to the central regenerative forces, and may even be part of them. The central regenerative life force escapes our direct observation, but there are many semantic synonyms for it: horme, entelechia, homeostasis, libido. All these words imply that there exist certain inner piloting forces having a final goal of development in themselves. We recognize their actions in the various principles of cure that will be mentioned. Clinically, we are aware of various overlapping processes that stimulate healing and recovery or take away resistance to cure. Psychotherapy is always a combination of several functions: exploration, autoregulation, removing the hindrances for insight, correction, confession, and liberation. What are the other processes we are able to discern at this moment? The ritualistic function of psychotherapy. The inner decision to go into therapy already brings the forces of hope into action. The coming and going of the patient to the therapist's office takes the place of primitive ceremonial that originally was able to dissolve tensions. Our over-technologized and intellectualized world has forgotten or repressed the cathartic function of praying, of being together in a church group, or, as we see in more primitive people, the preparatory function of ritual dancing, all of which lead to spontaneous readjustment of drives. Stewart gives a touching example of the burial dancing rites of Negritos. These dances replace the feeling of loss of the beloved. In this technical age, people are deprived of the ritualistic feast, the initiation rite, the carnival, all the short-lasting collective psychoses and common regressions that serve to revitalize man and make him better able to accept the frustrations of everyday life. Every therapist who experiences how patients protest against any change in the therapeutic schedule, and especially against the therapist's weekends and vacations.
The concept of pseudo-cure. Although most therapists are acquainted with Freud's concept of escape into health, it still is a mystery in many cases. Why does a patient suddenly drop his symptoms? This is not only a psychiatric problem. In somatic medicine, we also find that a patient often tries to deny his signs of sickness. The fear of disease and operation often makes the cancer patient feel no pain and be temporarily without ominous symptoms until it is too late to give him the right help. In psychotherapy, we must repeatedly deal with this phenomenon of denial of disease symptoms, especially when, in the course of treatment, the patient starts to develop resistance against his treatment. He clings to his neurosis with new defensive devices. As I described more elaborately in a former chapter, there are even people with the neurosis of not being able to be ill. They never allow themselves any pity or pain. Thus, they do not give their defenses and immunity an opportunity to become stronger. At the moment of crisis, these strong people can suddenly break down. The transition from pseudo-cure to real cure is medically not well defined. I have seen many a neurotic patient who, out of defense against therapy, escaped into health and allegedly remained healthy. Pseudo-cure implies at least that something defensive is at work inside the patient, something that can be directed toward the good or toward the bad. The problem is, what happens to the original drive or conflict or inner defense that may have caused the symptom or illness? Is the patient from then on happy or pseudo-happy? Is the euphoria of the patient and his hedonistic well-being our only aim? The philosophical implications of this question are tremendous. Being without medical symptoms is not always the greatest happiness on earth. Suffering can be meaningful in order to reach a new goal in life. There are other and higher values which make man a goal-directed being. But in an epoch of yearning for success and glamour, pseudo-values are so easily accepted. Indeed, many patients prefer to sacrifice their symptoms instead of their neurosis. They stop drinking, for instance, but express their self-destructive tendencies in different ways. I have seen patients who became automatic records of their master's, therapist's, voice, pretending to be happy. They had actually only exchanged one symptom, their original aggression, for another, compulsive health. The older, mere physical medical science also aimed at making patients into beings without symptoms. Yet, symptomatic handling of the case did not remove the underlying deep mental conflicts that had been converted into the disease. In a recent experimental psychological testing program in a large hospital, Rorschach tests demonstrated that patients in the internal and surgical wards were just as conflict-ridden as those in the psychiatric department. The former merely expressed their troubles differently, e.g., in elaborate psychosomatic conversions. What most often occurs in the clinical setting of repeated psychotherapeutic sessions is that the patient first sheds his obvious organic symptoms. Many an anxiety neurotic who formerly suffered frequent colds has none at all during psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. In the course of therapy, the role of these little ailments as expression of early dependency needs and infantile wishes must be analyzed and worked through.
But it often occurs that more provoking symptoms, such as phobias or sexual impotence, also suddenly disappear, in order that the psyche may escape the personal encounter with the investigatory judge represented by the therapist. Various intrapsychic and interpersonal reactions may come into play in such a process of pseudocure. The patient says, "I feel better and can go now," but really feels worse. He represses his symptoms with greater, though hidden, anxiety to forestall the final confession of hidden hostility and hidden traumatic material. He would rather sacrifice his symptoms than his neurosis. The patient may say, "I feel better," but is worse without feeling it. The unconscious fear of the neurosis and its implications juggles the patient into a magic feeling of well-being that, as a rule, does not last long. Sometimes the symptoms are merely repressed to please the therapist, what we usually call transference cure. The need for a magic and omnipotent therapist is often greater than the need for pity-provoking symptoms. Often, the neurotic patient may find a third person, a scapegoat or fetish, on whom to transfer his affection or guilt or hatred. While, in the meantime, borrowing strength from the therapist, the patient uses this strategy of displacement to escape confrontation with the real turmoil in his unconscious. For instance, instead of falling in love with the therapist with all the entangling involvements of having to confess this and be rejected.
Chapter 19. Cure and Pseudo-Cure in Psychiatry. The age-old question of why people become sick and what their sickness means to them has no single answer, particularly when the problem is one of mental illness. We now know that it is too simple to state merely that bad germs or punishing gods interfere with our lives. We have gradually learned to view disease not only as a conglomeration of bad signs and symptoms, but as an expression of life that tells us something about the eternal struggle of forces in the universe, and that warns us of crisis and death. This more critical attitude is especially reflected in the modern interpretation of mental disease and the problem of what emotional and mental disturbances mean to man. We can often simplify our method of approach by asking ourselves not what disease is and what causes it, but by posing the question in a paradoxical way. How and why does man get better? How and why does he attain a state of living that satisfies him again? Why and how do people recover from neurotic or mental illnesses? The greater our lack of verifiable facts, the greater the avalanche of biased literature regarding the ways psychotherapy and mental healing work. Studying it all, one finds it very difficult indeed to discover wherein lies the quintessence of healing and cure. This is not so strange. Even in the somatic branch of medicine, one cannot be completely sure about the basic curative principles in different forms of physical and chemotherapy. Although the pure somaticists are fairly well agreed as to the clinical usefulness of special drugs, e.g. antibiotics, there is much difference of opinion in the field of theoretical explanation. Many of these drugs do not have merely a sterilizing action, i.e., only killing the bad germs, but somehow also seem to stimulate the general defensive and regenerative action of the organism. Whenever psychological methods enter the picture, with their increased dependence on words and their semantic meaning, basic theoretical concepts vary in accordance with the more or less conscious philosophy of the scholar. As a result, the danger of both verbal and theoretical confusion increases. The adherents to rigid, orthodox schools of psychotherapy use various words and terms in different ways. This plethora of confusing terminology, however, does not imply that there are not sufficient workable and practical clinical concepts to lead the eager student safely through the labyrinth of diverse viewpoints and terms. The danger is that many acolytes are nursed into an increasing dependence on rigid theoretical concepts. Much of our theory is more dependent on the enthusiastic acclaim of our audience and patients than on verifiable facts. I agree with Iago Galdston that every physician and medical philosopher through the ages has, perforce, based his work on some theoretical concept or hidden inner myth as to the cause of disease, and has made unobtrusive use of some theory on the dynamics of cure, both related to the prevailing natural philosophy of his time. In our time, with its neglect of philosophy of method and knowledge in medicine, partly stimulated by the triumphant expansion of therapeutic possibilities and attendant medications, many a therapist cherishes his own private concept of what is going on in the recuperating patient. There is no use discussing this with him because, in our phase of medicine and psychiatry, we too often can justify our faulty concepts by referring to our private experience, that beclouded word in philosophy. I want to limit my survey to the fundamental problems and principles related to the process of healing and cure in the psychological treatment of patients. However, an understanding of these curative principles is impossible without acknowledgement of the concepts of spontaneous cure, pseudo-cure, and after-cure. Spontaneous cure and recovery outside therapy. One of the most neglected chapters in medicine is that of spontaneous cure and recovery. The fact that a physician's interference is not always needed hurts our narcissistic feelings, and the medical profession finds the idea of spontaneous recovery difficult to swallow. I am frequently criticized after lectures on emergency psychotherapy, in which I have mentioned that sometimes psychotherapeutic intervention is unnecessary. Yet, theoretically speaking, the laws under which spontaneous recovery takes place should belong to the most important branch of medicine. Well-studied instances of spontaneous recovery have been reported even in cancer. This, of course, does not mean that in cases of cancer we can take chances on such spontaneous recovery. Statistically, the chance of malignant development without medical interference is much greater, and most of the favorable factors involved are as yet unknown to us. But we do know that self-regulating, homeostatic mechanisms in the
Part 4. The concept of healing. Finally, the multitude of principles active in healing and cure are investigated. The very principles of healing and cure used in psychotherapy are also found in the therapeutic encounters in general practice. The purpose of this book is to elaborate on the manifold curative principles. Yet, there is also a hidden purpose behind the reader who scans through the book. Those purposes do not always coincide. That is why, at the end of the book, having examined practical and psychiatric philosophy, I return to a more general pondering of what healing and cure mean to us. Chapter 18. The Therapeutic Encounter. Several psychological processes come into action as soon as a sick human being consults a physician. This is as true for the general practitioner as for the specialist. These processes are dependent on usually unconscious, pre-existing expectations on the part of both doctor and patient. Scientific expectations, wishes for magic cure, infantile patterns, and unconscious cravings all play a part in the complicated doctor-patient relationship and influence the therapeutic process. That is why we need to investigate what is going on psychologically during the therapeutic encounter. The doctor-patient relationship is a rather complicated one, dependent on the personalities of both doctor and patient. Often, the first therapeutic encounter sets the pattern for the relationship. Will the patient or the doctor dominate? Is there rapport? While it is not possible to describe minutely the various pitfalls that may be encountered in the relationship, I would like to give a general survey of expectations and occurrences. Even in general practice, more than 50% of patients come to the doctor with so-called functional or neurotic complaints. That means that something in their relationship with themselves or with fellow human beings has gone wrong. They feel unhappy. Their bodies react to conflict and unhappiness with some malfunction, and they go to the physician for help and advice. Sometimes a physical ailment disguises a desire to talk openly about psychological problems and difficulties. If the general practitioner lives far away from any psychological or psychiatric center, he should not be afraid of handling these problems himself.
By merely wanting to understand what is going on in the patient's mind, he can often help more than he realizes. On the other hand, let him not give immediate advice to his patients during a busy consultation hour. Let him try to reserve some extra time for them. They will be very grateful for that because they will know that their search for communication and contact may be gratified. Although most people who ask for immediate advice on their difficulties usually want to be fortified in their faulty opinions, the doctor's passive attitude of listening and understanding can be of tremendous importance to the patient. Giving time is a form of giving attention and affection. Time is one of the most important of medical tools, and it is not to be neglected no matter how busy the doctor may be. The magic expectation of the patient. Every patient who enters a doctor's office has some unconscious expectation of cure, of being helped. It may be that he has already tried to help himself with one or more of the many advertised medicaments. Then he enters the consultation room and unconsciously expects new miracles so that his real or imagined suffering may end at once. It is not necessary for him to consciously look upon the doctor as a magician, to be awed by the medical profession. Every doctor is considered a combination shaman, medicine man, and scientist. His white coat fortifies the suggestion. So do his instruments, his tablets, and his injections. Quacks often respond better to this unconscious magic need of the sick person than do members of the official medical profession. The secret of their success lies in the fact that they are able to satisfy hidden primitive needs, as well as the fact that the inner need to go to a quack for cure may represent a form of rebellion against official habits, parents, or a cold scientific world. Transference function and trial relation. In pain and sorrow, man again becomes partially the helpless infant who wants help and protection from some maternal figure. Severely wounded soldiers on the battlefield nearly always call for their mothers. Nearly every patient needs to repeat some of his early infantile feelings of pleasure dependency and transfer them to his new helper. Father and mother can no longer help, but the miracles they did for him in his infancy he wants to have done by someone else. That is why so many patients meet the doctor full of confidence. In anticipation, they agree with his prescriptions and advice. Of course, the opposite.
Chapter 22. Medicine and the Snake. The staff of Asclepius, encircled by the snake, has been from olden times the symbol of medicine. Every investigation of symbolism has to take various functions of the human mind under scrutiny. A symbol is a condensation of different conscious and unconscious images. The Greek word symbolain means putting together. Thus, according to this original meaning, in a symbol, different ideas of identity are thrown together. Man, the creative animal, was able to see likeness and analogy in various forms and functions, and he used this perception of sameness to form his fantasies, initial ideas, and metaphors. Man's archaic thinking, still in its magic phase of development, used these first hunches and intuitions to exert power over his dangerous environment. Man's initial thinking was full of magic strategy to ward off the power and revenge of the gods. Yet his magic thinking was also full of intuitive awareness and a creative catching of intimate relations between form and function even before man's words were able to express those ideas. Symbols were drawn and sculptured even before the word was created. Each symbol is the transmogrification of the world or its parts into a cosmogonical interpretation. That is why we have to go back to look at man's primitive and archaic art when we want to trace an idea to its very beginning. Why the snake became the symbol of medicine can never be reduced to one simple likeness or analogy. Various animistic and magic meanings of the snake gradually joined into a permanent token. Although the name Asclepius, for the god of medicine, comes from the Greek language asklepios, snake, the adoration of the snake as a life-giving power and god of fertility can be found in much older cultures, such as Egypt and Sumer, and in quite isolated peoples and cultures, such as the Aztecs and the American Indians.
Snake worship exists in various sects even in our days. Asclepius was a Greek god, son of Apollo. It was thought that he once lived inside a snake. The idea of the life-giving power residing inside a snake is nearly universal and is even nowadays found in various primitive tribes. This opens the question, why did and does the snake arouse these various symbolic ideas of likeness? In the first place, the snake is related to the eternal problem of life and death. Being caught by his poisonous fangs can lead to nearly immediate destruction. Man can be ensnared in the grip of a monster, a dragon, a serpent, a boa constrictor, the ominous token of all threat and danger hovering over him. Deep unconscious fears are aroused by this primordial monster that sucks in what was given life to. It is as if the primordial mother takes back what she created. Let us not forget that ancient heathenism was pregnant of the idea of giving the firstborn back to the womb of Baal in order to promote fertility. Indeed, in many mythologies, birth takes place out of the world snake. The panic at birth conditions man's first reminiscences. The rhythms and undulatory movements of the womb at birth deliver a modal likeness with the undulatory movements of the serpent. Some snake dances are performed by women of the tribe as long as a woman is in labor in order to keep the bad spirits away and to stimulate the snake-like rhythmic movements of the womb. Imitative rhythm as a means of magic power is found in many symbolic dances. The head of Medusa, with its vision of whirling snakes around the introitus, represents a typical picture of the pangs of birth. Looking at Medusa's head could change the trespasser into a frozen image of stone. But the snake represented also a male phallic deity, the magic giver of life. The serpent, ready to strike, fits into the image of male sexual attack, of erection and rape. Aaron's rod changed into a snake to overawe Pharaoh with the power of God. And Moses, by divine order, made a brazen image of the serpent, put it on a stick, and used it as a magic cure against the snakebite. For a long time, this sign of phallic adoration remained with the children of Israel. But the snake is not only a token of death, or a symbol of birth, or a phallic creation. As the serpent continually sheds its skin, the snake became a token of renewal, revigoration, reincarnation, and finally of eternal life. In the miraculous omnipotent potion of the Middle Ages, the theriac, snake meat and snake skin were important ingredients. The serpent as a symbol of longevity and eternity was already very soon in history depicted as the Ouroboros, the snake biting in its own tail, thus forming the Wheel of Eternity. In the Garden of Eden, the snake seduced the woman and the man to lose their nirvanic innocence and to eat the apple from the tree of knowledge.
The honest, conscientious therapist has a serious moral problem to face. His profession obliges him to make his patients temporarily dependent on him, and this may appeal too much to his own sense of importance or sense of power. I have also witnessed and suffered the opposite, being dragged into the value system of the patient. This dilemma of mutual influence and mental contagion is equally strong for surgeons and general practitioners. The therapist must be continually aware of the impact his statements and deductions have on his patients, who often listen in awe to the man who is, for them, the omnipotent magician. The authoritarian voice often arises automatically. Unceasing vigilance is necessary to let the patient discover his own truths. Most practitioners of psychology and psychiatry are very much aware of the moral responsibility their profession imposes on them. The tools of psychology are dangerous in the hands of the wrong men. Modern educational methods can be applied to therapy to streamline man's brain and condition his opinions so that his thinking conforms with certain ideological systems or schools of psychiatric thinking. Medicine, and especially psychiatry, may become more and more involved in political strategy, as we have seen in menticide, brainwashing, and thought reform. Scientific ideology can be just as much misused as political ideology.
For this reason, psychologists and psychiatrists must become doubly aware of the nature of the persuasive tools they use. The effects on students of the overemphasis of special therapeutic techniques by adepts knowing all the facts and tricks should be especially considered, since many are caught for long years in training and control analysis. The overemphasis on diplomas and labels and specified esoteric training may easily lead toward greater pressure toward conformism, rationalization, and oversimplification of principles that are in contrast to the personal, individualized sensitivity needed. Man's critical and rational faculty can be a destructive one, destroying or disguising his basic doubts and ambivalences born out of tragic despair, that creator of human sensitivity. Every powerful orthodoxy can change man's doubts into dogma and prejudice. The danger of modern psychotherapy, this includes psychology, psychoanalysis, and psychiatry, is the tendency toward formalizing human intuition and empathy and toward making an abstraction of emotion and spontaneity. I see, for instance, a tragic contradiction in the attempt to make conceptual ideas out of the emotions of love and beauty. If this is possible, we will find ourselves finally in a world where there is no inspiration and ecstasy, but only a reduced form of coldly formulated understanding. Psychoanalytic exploration has given us a clear description of what happens in the mind during prolonged mental contact between human beings. In every intense human relation, each participant reacts at least partially in terms of the illusions and expectations developed in his own childhood. The therapist must remain constantly aware that the act of observing changes the observed. If the therapist is not careful, or if he does not understand the mutual transfer of hidden feelings and ideas, or if in his compulsive zest to explain everything he becomes too coercive, he may force the patient into acceptance of his point of view, instead of helping him attain a point of view of his own. Psychotherapy can unobtrusively become mental intrusion of a dangerous kind. Experience with patients has taught me that faulty technique, wild analysis, not resolving the resistance, etc., can give many a patient feelings of being bogged down. Sometimes patients feel as if they have to remain in servile submission to the doctor. I have seen whole families and sects swear by such modern witch doctors. No wonder that sound psychotherapeutic instruction requires the therapist to submit himself to the very techniques and methods he is about to apply to others, so that, armed with the knowledge of his own prejudices, blind spots, and unsound needs, he will not try to use his profession to mastermind other people's lives. Just as there exists deliberate political brainwashing, so can there be a chemical or suggestive mental intrusion. Man can use his knowledge of the mind of a fellow being not to help him, but to hurt him and bog him down. Misusing man's empathy not for sympathy but for antipathy is the hereditary sin of man expressed in psychological terms. The hidden magician in man can increase his magic power by increasing